Isabella Montgomery had lived her entire life in luxury. She was the only daughter of a prestigious and wealthy family, the Montgomerys, who were known for their sprawling estates, high society connections, and vast business empire. From a young age, Isabella had been groomed to take over the family's fortune, attending the finest schools, meeting the right people, and adhering to the strict expectations of high society. But for all the wealth and comfort that surrounded her, Isabella often felt a deep loneliness. Her life, though gilded and perfect on the outside, lacked the one thing she truly desired: freedom to choose her own path. Her parents, particularly her father, Alexander Montgomery, had always been clear about her future. She was expected to marry well, to continue the family legacy, and to maintain their social status. Isabella had never rebelled against these expectations until she met Gabriel. Gabriel was a homeless poet who lived on the streets of the city, far removed from the glamorous world Isabella inhabited. He had once been a student with a bright future, but a series of tragic events had left him without a home, wandering the streets with only his words to keep him going. Despite his difficult circumstances, Gabriel never lost his sense of wonder about the world. He saw beauty in everything: the way the morning light hit the buildings, the small kindnesses people showed each other, and most of all, in the words he scribbled in his worn-out notebooks. Their worlds could not have been more different, but fate had a way of bringing them together. One evening, after a particularly exhausting charity gala, Isabella decided to take a walk through the city, away from the stifling world of social obligations and endless expectations. She wandered into a part of the city she rarely visited, a place where the streets were quiet, and the people were far from the polished world she knew. It was there, in a small park, that she first saw him. Gabriel sat on a bench, hunched over a notebook, furiously writing something. His clothes were worn, his shoes scuffed, and his hair unkempt. But there was something about him that caught her attention. Perhaps it was the intensity in his expression, or the way he seemed completely absorbed in his own world, unaware of the city around him. Curiosity got the better of her, and she approached him cautiously. "What are you writing?" she asked softly. Gabriel looked up, startled by her presence. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "It's just some thoughts," he replied, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. "I write poems, mostly." Isabella, intrigued by the idea of someone so dedicated to their craft despite their circumstances, asked if she could see what he had written. Gabriel hesitated, but something in her gentle demeanor made him hand over the notebook. As Isabella read his words, she was captivated. Gabriel's poetry was raw, filled with emotion and beauty, capturing the essence of life in a way she had never experienced before. She looked at him in awe. "These are incredible," she said sincerely. Gabriel shrugged. "They are just words. They don't mean much." But to Isabella, they meant everything. In Gabriel's words, she found a glimpse of the world she had always longed for, a world of freedom, creativity, and deep emotion, far from the superficiality of her life. After that night, Isabella couldn't stop thinking about Gabriel. She found herself returning to the park more and more often, hoping to see him again. Each time she did, they would sit together and talk, sometimes for hours. Gabriel would share his poems with her, and Isabella would listen, mesmerized by his ability to find beauty in the simplest things. In return, Isabella began to open up about her own life, something she rarely did with anyone. She told Gabriel about her family, her upbringing, and the pressures that came with being a Montgomery. Gabriel listened with a quiet understanding, never judging her for the privilege she had been born into. He saw past the wealth and status, recognizing the loneliness that lay beneath. Despite the vast differences between them, their friendship deepened with each passing day. Gabriel's honesty and authenticity drew Isabella in, while her kindness and genuine interest in his life touched Gabriel in ways he hadn't expected. They became each other's escape from the worlds they were trapped in. But as their bond grew stronger, so did Isabella's feelings for him. She found herself falling in love with Gabriel, not for who he wasn't, but for who he was. His words, his passion, his heart, everything about him made her feel alive in a way she had never felt before. Yet, Isabella knew that her feelings for Gabriel would be met with outrage from her family. They would never accept a homeless man as a suitable partner for her, no matter how much she loved him. It wasn't long before Isabella's secret visits to the park were discovered. One evening, her father's driver followed her and reported back to Alexander Montgomery. When her father confronted her about where she had been going, Isabella couldn't hide the truth any longer. "I've met someone," she admitted, her voice trembling. "His name is Gabriel, and he's different." "Different?" her father repeated, his voice full of disdain. "What do you mean, different? Who is this man?" Isabella took a deep breath and revealed the truth. "He's a poet, but his are homeless." The moment those words left her lips, she knew what was coming. Her father's face turned red with fury. "A homeless man," he spat. "Do you realize what this would do to our family if anyone found out? You are a Montgomery, Isabella. You cannot be seen with someone like that." "But I love him," Isabella said, her voice breaking. Alexander slammed his fist on the table. "Love? You don't know what love is. You're young, naive. This is nothing but a passing infatuation. You'll forget about him." But Isabella couldn't forget. She refused to let her father dictate her heart. The days that followed were filled with tension. Her family tried to separate her from Gabriel, forbidding her from leaving the estate, cutting off her access to the outside world. But Isabella was determined to see him again. One night, unable to bear the thought of never seeing Gabriel again, Isabella made a decision. She packed a small bag, wrote a note to her family explaining that she couldn't live a life dictated by their expectations, and slipped out of the house. She ran to the park, hoping Gabriel would be there, praying he hadn't given up on her. When she arrived, she saw him sitting on the bench, his notebook in his hands, just as he had been the first night they met. "Gabriel," she called out, breathless from running. He looked up, surprise and concern in his eyes. "Isabella, what's wrong?" Without hesitation, she threw herself into his arms. "I can't stay there anymore. I want to be with you, no matter what." Gabriel held her tightly, his heart racing. "Are you sure? You'll be leaving everything behind." "I don't care," she whispered. "You've shown me what it means to truly live, and I don't want to go back to that empty world." Together, they decided to leave the city and start anew. They knew it wouldn't be easy. Isabella had never lived without wealth, and Gabriel was used to surviving day by day. But they believed that with each other, they could find a way. Isabella and Gabriel moved to a small town, far from the expectations and judgments of her former life. They rented a modest apartment, and for the first time, Isabella experienced what it was like to live a simple life. She found work at a local bookstore, while Gabriel continued to write his poems, eventually finding a small publisher interested in his work. Their days were filled with challenges, but also with joy. They cooked together, explored the town, and spent quiet evenings reading by the fire. Isabella had never been happier, and Gabriel, though still haunted by the hardships he had endured, felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Though they struggled financially, they had each other, and that was enough. Years passed, and Isabella and Gabriel built a life filled with love and purpose. Gabriel's poetry gained recognition, and he published several collections, many of which were inspired by his journey with Isabella. Isabella, too, found her place in the world, running a small cafe and bookstore where she hosted poetry readings and supported local artists. Though her family never fully accepted her decision, they eventually came to respect her for following her heart. And in the end, Isabella had found the one thing she had always longed for: freedom. The freedom to love, to live authentically, and to create a life on her own terms. Together, Isabella and Gabriel proved that love could transcend social boundaries, that wealth and status were meaningless without true connection. They had found in each other what so many spend a lifetime searching for: a love that was real, enduring, and strong enough to face the world. In their quiet, peaceful life, they had everything they needed. Their love, born in the most unlikely of circumstances, had not only survived, it had flourished, becoming the foundation of a life they had built together, far from the expectations of others but perfectly true to themselves. As time went on, Isabella and Gabriel's love continued to deepen, but their life together was not without its hardships. Living modestly, they faced financial struggles that often weighed heavily on their relationship. The small town they had moved to offered them peace, but the reality of balancing work, bills, and Gabriel's slow-growing success as a poet was difficult. Still, they never regretted their decision to leave the life of wealth and privilege behind. One winter, when Gabriel's latest book failed to sell as expected, and Isabella's cafe faced challenges due to low tourist seasons, the couple found themselves at a crossroads. Their love remained strong, but the pressure of daily life began to take a toll on their spirits. One night, after another difficult day of trying to make ends meet, Gabriel found Isabella staring out of their window, lost in thought. "Are you okay?" he asked gently, sitting beside her. Isabella sighed. "I'm just thinking about how much has changed. We've come so far, but sometimes I wonder if I've made things harder for you by leaving my family's life behind." Gabriel took her hand. "We chose this together. Yes, it's hard, but I wouldn't trade our life for anything. You've given me something no amount of wealth could: a reason to live, to write, to hope. We'll get through this." Isabella smiled through the worry in her eyes. "I know. I believe in us." Despite the difficulties, they held on to each other, knowing that their bond was far more valuable than any material comfort they had left behind. One summer afternoon, as Isabella was working in the cafe, she saw a familiar figure standing by the door. It was her father, Alexander Montgomery. He had come alone, without the usual entourage of assistants or drivers. His face showed the signs of aging, and there was a softness in his eyes that Isabella had never seen before. "Isabella," he said quietly, stepping inside. For a moment, she stood frozen, unsure of how to react. It had been years since she'd left, and although she had sent letters to her family explaining her choice, this was the first time her father had come to see her. "Father," she replied, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions she felt. "I came to talk," he said, looking around at the cozy cafe. I've been thinking about you. About everything." Isabella led him to a table and sat down across from him, waiting for him to speak. "I was wrong," Alexander began, his voice heavy with regret. "I was so focused on protecting the family name, on keeping you in that world of wealth and status, that I didn't see how much it was suffocating you. When you left, I didn't understand. But I've come to realize that you were right to follow your heart." Isabella's breath caught in her throat. Her father, the man who had always been so proud, so unwilling to bend, was apologizing. "I'm proud of you," he continued. "You built a life for yourself, on your own terms. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I wanted to tell you that I'm sorry." Isabella, tears welling in her eyes, reached across the table and took her father's hand. "I've always wanted you to understand why I left. I never wanted to hurt you or Mother, but I had to live my life, not the one you planned for me." Alexander nodded, his eyes glistening with emotion. "And I see that now. I just want to be a part of your life again, if you'll allow it." It was the beginning of a long healing process between Isabella and her family. Over time, Alexander visited more often, and though their relationship was not perfect, they found common ground in their love for each other. Isabella's mother, Elizabeth, was slower to come around, still clinging to old ideas of status, but even she softened as she saw how happy Isabella had become. As Isabella rebuilt her relationship with her father, Gabriel's poetry began to gain attention beyond their small town. One day, he received a letter from a well-known literary agent who had come across one of his collections. The agent expressed interest in representing Gabriel and helping him reach a wider audience. Gabriel was overwhelmed by the possibility. After years of struggling, of wondering if his words would ever find their place in the world, it seemed that his moment had finally come. When he told Isabella the news, she embraced him tightly, tears of joy in her eyes. "I always knew your words would touch the world," she whispered. With the agent's help, Gabriel's next collection was published to critical acclaim, and his work began to appear in major literary journals. Invitations to speak at poetry readings and literary events poured in, and soon Gabriel was traveling to cities far and wide, sharing his words with audiences who connected deeply with his story. Through it all, Gabriel remained humble, never forgetting the difficult days he had spent on the streets, scribbling in his notebook. He knew that his success was not just his own, it was something he had built with Isabella, whose belief in him had never wavered. As Gabriel's career blossomed, he and Isabella began to dream of ways they could give back. They decided to use some of Gabriel's earnings to create a foundation that would support homeless artists and writers, giving them the resources and opportunities they needed to share their work with the world. They called it the Montgomery Grayson Foundation, a nod to both of their family names and the life they had built together. Through the foundation, they funded workshops, provided grants, and organized exhibitions for those who had stories to tell but lacked the means to do so. The foundation became a way for them to extend their love and support to others who, like Gabriel, had been overlooked or forgotten by society. It was their way of ensuring that no one's talent or voice would go unheard. Years later, as they stood together at the opening of a new art gallery sponsored by their foundation, Isabella reflected on the incredible journey they had taken together. "I never imagined my life would turn out this way," she said softly, looking up at Gabriel. "But I wouldn't change a thing." Gabriel smiled, pulling her close. "Neither would I. We built this life together, brick by brick, word by word." Isabella and Gabriel's love story became one that people told for years to come, a story of defying expectations, of finding beauty in unlikely places, and of building a life rooted in love and authenticity. Though they had faced challenges and hardships, they had emerged stronger, united by the deep connection they shared. In the quiet moments of their life, sitting together by the fire or walking through the town that had become their home, they knew that their love had given them something more valuable than wealth or status. It had given them freedom, joy, and a sense of purpose that no material possession could ever replace. Their love had endured, not because it was easy, but because it was real. And in the end, that was all that mattered. They had chosen each other, again and again, and in doing so, they had created a legacy that would last far beyond their time. A legacy of love, poetry, and the belief that no matter where you come from, or what life throws at you, true love can always find a way. As the years passed, Isabella and Gabriel's foundation grew into a global movement. The Montgomery Grayson Foundation became a beacon for artists and writers from disadvantaged backgrounds, offering them not only financial support but also mentorship, resources, and the recognition they deserved. Through the foundation, many found their voices and transformed their lives in ways they had never imagined. Isabella and Gabriel continued to work side by side, each finding fulfillment in the lives they touched. Isabella, whose cafe had become a community hub, often hosted gatherings where the artists supported by the foundation could showcase their work. These events were more than just exhibitions, they were celebrations of perseverance, resilience, and the power of human connection. The couple's love for each other remained as strong as ever, deepened by the shared sense of purpose that had defined their lives. Their days were filled with laughter, creativity, and quiet moments of reflection, where they often marveled at how far they had come from those early days when they had met in the park. One spring evening, while walking along the riverbank, Gabriel paused and looked out at the water, his hand entwined with Isabella's. "Do you ever wonder," he began softly, "what our lives would have been like if we had followed the paths others laid out for us?" Isabella smiled, her eyes reflecting the golden light of the setting Sunday. "I think about it sometimes, but then I remember how empty I felt back then, before I met you. It's not the life I wanted, not the life we've built together. We chose this life, and I wouldn't trade it for anything." Gabriel squeezed her hand. "Neither would I. We've built something far more meaningful than wealth or success. We've built a life rooted in love and truth." They stood there in silence for a few moments, the sound of the river gently flowing by, knowing that they had truly found something rare and beautiful in each other, a love that had defied the odds and blossomed into something greater than either of them could have imagined. As Isabella and Gabriel grew older, they began to think about the future of the Montgomery Grayson Foundation and how they could ensure that its mission continued for generations to come. They had always believed that the foundation was about more than just supporting artists, it was about giving people a chance to find their voice, to tell their stories, and to be heard in a world that often silenced them. After much thought, they decided to step back from the day-to-day operations of the foundation and entrust it to a younger generation of leaders, people who shared their passion for art, writing, and helping others. Isabella and Gabriel worked closely with these new leaders, mentoring them and sharing the values that had guided the foundation from the beginning. One of the new directors was a young woman named Clara, who had once been a beneficiary of the foundation herself. She had grown up in a tough neighborhood and had used her love of painting to escape the hardships of her environment. Through the foundation's support, Clara had developed her talent, eventually becoming a well-known artist. Now, she was eager to give back and carry forward the work that had changed her life. Clara often spoke of how Isabella and Gabriel's love story had inspired her. "You both taught me that love is not just about two people," she said during one of their meetings. "It's about the community you build together, the lives you touch, and the legacy you leave behind." Isabella and Gabriel knew they had made the right choice in passing the torch to Clara and the new team. They had faith that the foundation's future was in good hands, and they felt a deep sense of peace knowing that their life's work would continue to flourish long after they were gone. One day, as Isabella was walking through her cafe, she noticed a young man sitting in the corner, scribbling in a notebook. His clothes were worn, and his face was marked with the signs of struggle, but there was a familiar intensity in his eyes, the same intensity she had seen in Gabriel's eyes all those years ago. Curious, she approached him. "What are you writing?" she asked gently, her voice warm and inviting. The young man looked up, surprised. "Just, some thoughts. It's nothing special." Isabella smiled. "May I see?" After a moment's hesitation, the young man handed her the notebook. Isabella read the words on the page and felt a wave of nostalgia wash over her. The raw emotion, the unpolished beauty of his words, it reminded her so much of Gabriel's early poems. "These are beautiful," she said, handing the notebook back to him. "You have a gift." The young man shrugged. It doesn't matter. No one really cares about poetry anymore. Isabella sat down beside him. I used to think that too. But let me tell you a story. She told him about how she had met Gabriel, about his journey from the streets to becoming a published poet, and how they had built a life together based on love, creativity, and following their hearts. The young man listened intently, his eyes widening with each word. By the time she finished, he looked at her with a mixture of hope and disbelief. Do you think I could have a chance too? Isabella smiled warmly. Everyone deserves a chance. The Montgomery Grayson Foundation can help you if you're willing to take that first step. The young man's eyes lit up with gratitude, and in that moment, Isabella knew that her story, and Gabriel's story, had come full circle. They had once been the dreamers, the ones who needed help to find their way. Now, they were the ones giving others the chance to pursue their dreams. In the twilight of their lives, Isabella and Gabriel found themselves sitting in the garden of their home, surrounded by the flowers they had planted over the years. It was a peaceful evening, the air filled with the sweet scent of lavender and roses, and the sky painted in hues of pink and gold. As they sat together, hand in hand, they reflected on the life they had built, a life full of love, creativity, challenges, and triumphs. They had faced the world together, and in doing so, they had created something truly special. Gabriel turned to Isabella, his voice soft but full of love. We've had a good life, haven't we? Isabella smiled, her eyes filled with warmth. The best. They sat in silence for a while, simply enjoying each other's presence, knowing that their love had endured through every trial, every joy, and every heartache. It was a love that had grown deeper with each passing year, a love that had shaped not only their lives but the lives of so many others. As the stars began to twinkle in the sky above them, Isabella and Gabriel knew that their legacy, their love, their work, and the foundation they had built, would live on long after they were gone. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by the beauty of the life they had created, they felt at peace. Their love, like the flowers in their garden, would continue to bloom for generations to come. It was a love that had defied expectations, transcended boundaries, and changed the world in ways they had never imagined. A love that, in the end, had truly lasted forever. Years after Gabriel's poetry had garnered recognition and their foundation had changed countless lives, Isabella received a special letter. It was from a young woman who had recently benefited from the Montgomery Grayson Foundation. Her name was Lily, a writer who had lived through hardship and found hope in Gabriel's work. The letter was not like the many they had received before. It was deeply personal, and Isabella felt a sense of urgency as she read it. Lily wrote about how Gabriel's words had been her salvation, pulling her out of the darkest time in her life. She spoke of how his poetry had reached her at a moment when she felt lost, and how it gave her the courage to keep going. I wanted to thank you both, the letter said. I don't know if you understand the impact you've had, but your work has saved me. Gabriel's poetry showed me that even in the darkest moments, there is beauty and love. I hope one day I can meet you and express my gratitude in person. Isabella sat by the window, holding the letter close. She felt a wave of emotion sweep over her as she realized the full impact of Gabriel's life and work, not just on Lily, but on all the people he had touched through his words. Later that evening, she shared the letter with Gabriel, who, though aging, still had that spark of passion in his eyes. As he read it, his expression softened, and he let out a long breath. I never thought my words could mean so much to someone, he said quietly. I always wrote because I needed to. But to think they've helped someone like Lily, that makes it all worth it. Isabella smiled at him, her heart full. You've always had that power, Gabriel. Your words have changed lives, mine included. They decided to invite Lily to their home, eager to meet the woman whose life had been so deeply touched by Gabriel's poetry. When Lily arrived, she was overwhelmed with emotion, standing in the presence of the people whose love and creativity had pulled her from the brink of despair. During her visit, they sat together in the garden, surrounded by flowers and trees that had witnessed decades of love and growth. Lily spoke about her own struggles and how Gabriel's poetry had given her hope. They spent hours talking, sharing stories, and connecting on a deep level. As Lily prepared to leave, she looked at Gabriel and Isabella with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything. You've given me a future I never thought I'd have." After she left, Gabriel and Isabella remained in the garden, reflecting on the meeting. It was moments like this, they realized, that made all the struggles worth it. They had built something lasting, something that would continue to touch lives, even after they were gone. As Gabriel's health began to decline, he found himself spending more time in their garden, where the serenity and beauty around him inspired his final poems. Each morning, he would sit under the shade of a tree with his notebook, writing lines that reflected on life, love, and the journey he and Isabella had shared. One morning, as Isabella brought him a cup of tea, she noticed Gabriel staring thoughtfully at the pages in front of him. He was working on what he knew would be his last poem, his final expression of the love he had carried with him all his life. "I want this to be for you," Gabriel said softly, his hand resting on the worn notebook. "For everything you've given me, and for the life we've built together." Isabella sat beside him, touched beyond words. Over the years, she had seen him pour his heart into his writing, but this felt different. This was the culmination of a lifetime of love, sacrifice, and growth. Together, they worked on the poem, with Isabella offering her thoughts and Gabriel writing down the words. It was a simple poem, yet filled with deep emotion. When they finished, Gabriel smiled at her, his eyes shining with gratitude and love. The poem read, ****, in the quiet spaces, I found you. In the darkest nights, you were my light. Through storms we weathered. Through dreams we chased. You were the home I always sought. A love that defied. A love that grew. Hand in hand, we faced the world. And built a life both brave and true. So now, in this garden, where time stands still, I leave these words for you, my heart. For love like ours, eternal, will. ****. Isabella read the words through tears, feeling the weight of their journey in each line. Gabriel's final gift to her was not just the poem, but the life they had shared, the love that had carried them through every challenge, every joy. Not long after finishing his final poem, Gabriel passed away peacefully in his sleep, with Isabella by his side. His death, though expected, left a deep void in her heart. He had been her partner, her muse, and her greatest love. But even in her grief, Isabella felt a profound sense of gratitude for the life they had shared. The day of Gabriel's funeral, people from all over came to pay their respects. Friends, family, and countless others who had been touched by his words gathered to honor the man whose poetry had brought beauty and hope to the world. As the sun set over the garden, Isabella stood by his grave, holding the final poem he had written for her. In her heart, she knew that Gabriel's words would live on, not just in books or in the memories of those who had heard him speak, but in the love they had shared, a love that transcended even death. Years after Gabriel's passing, the Montgomery Grayson Foundation continued to thrive, supporting generations of artists, poets, and writers who were inspired by his legacy. Isabella remained deeply involved in the foundation, finding solace in the work they had started together. In the garden where Gabriel had written his last poem, a statue was erected in his memory. It depicted him sitting on a bench, notebook in hand, with an inscription that read, "For love like ours, eternal will." Visitors from around the world came to the garden, drawn by the story of Isabella and Gabriel's love. They would sit by the statue, reading Gabriel's poems, and leave notes of their own, sharing stories of love, loss, and hope. The garden, once a private sanctuary for two lovers, had become a place of healing and inspiration for all who sought its beauty. And though Gabriel was gone, Isabella felt his presence with her every day, in the poems he had written, in the foundation they had built, and in the love that would forever live in her heart. She knew that their story would continue, not just in the lives they had touched, but in the belief they had shared, that true love, once found, never fades. It grows, it endures, and it carries on, long after the last page has been turned. In the end, Isabella had lived the life she had always dreamed of, a life filled with love, creativity, and purpose. And as she sat in the garden they had built together, she smiled, knowing that Gabriel's final poem had come true. Their love, eternal, would indeed last forever. After Gabriel's passing, Isabella found solace in tending to the garden they had built together. She spent hours every day among the flowers, pruning the roses and nurturing the lavender that Gabriel had loved so much. The garden had become not just a place of memory, but a living, breathing testament to their love, a space where time seemed to stand still, where the past and present coexisted in harmony. Though she missed Gabriel deeply, Isabella felt his presence in the garden. She could almost hear his voice in the rustle of the leaves, see him sitting on the bench beneath their favorite tree, notebook in hand. His words, his love, were woven into the very fabric of this place. And so, Isabella became the garden's keeper, not just for herself, but for all the people who had come to know Gabriel's story. As the years passed, more and more people visited the garden. It became a place of pilgrimage, not just for those who had been touched by Gabriel's poetry, but for anyone who sought peace, reflection, or healing. Isabella welcomed them all, guiding visitors through the garden's paths, sharing the story of her love with Gabriel, and listening to the stories they brought with them. One summer evening, a young couple arrived at the garden. They had heard of Gabriel's poems and had been moved by the love story that had endured through so much. As they wandered through the garden, they came across the bench with Gabriel's statue, where Isabella sat quietly, watching the sunset. The couple approached her hesitantly, unsure if they should disturb her. But Isabella smiled warmly and gestured for them to sit beside her. "You've come to see the garden," she said softly. "Tell me, what brought you here?" The young woman, Clara, looked at her partner, and then back at Isabella. "We've read Gabriel's poetry for years. It helped us through a difficult time. His words gave us hope." Isabella nodded, her heart full as she listened. That was always his gift, to find light in the darkest places. Clara hesitated, then asked, "Do you ever miss him? After all this time?" Isabella's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. "Every day. But I feel him here, in this garden. He may be gone, but his love is still with me. That's the thing about love, it doesn't disappear. It changes form, but it stays with you. Always." Clara reached out and took Isabella's hand. "Thank you for sharing him with the world." Isabella squeezed her hand gently. "It was never just my love. Gabriel's words belong to everyone, and so does this garden. It's a place where love endures, for all who seek it." As Isabella grew older, she began to think about the future of the garden. Though she had devoted her life to tending it, she knew that one day, it would need new caretakers, people who would continue to nurture the space and preserve its legacy for generations to come. She reached out to the Montgomery Grayson Foundation, which had flourished under Clara's leadership. Together, they created the Gabriel's Garden Initiative, a program dedicated to teaching young people about the importance of love, creativity, and connection. The initiative invited children from all walks of life to visit the garden, to learn about its history, and to plant new seeds that would grow into trees and flowers in the years to come. The program quickly became a success, with schools and community groups participating in the project. Each child who visited the garden was given a small sapling to plant, along with a notebook to write their own stories, poems, or thoughts. Just as Gabriel had once poured his heart into his notebooks, these children were encouraged to express themselves through words, to find their own voices in the quiet beauty of the garden. Isabella took great joy in watching the children run through the garden, planting seeds and writing in their notebooks. She saw in them the future of the garden, new generations who would carry forward Gabriel's legacy of love, creativity, and resilience. One afternoon, as she sat in the garden, a young girl approached her with a shy smile. She held out her notebook, which was filled with poems she had written during her visit. "Would you like to read one?" the girl asked. Isabella's heart swelled with pride. "I would love to." The girl sat beside her and handed over the notebook. As Isabella read the simple but heartfelt words, she felt a deep sense of peace. The garden was alive with new voices, new stories, new love. And in that moment, she knew that Gabriel's spirit would live on, not just in the memories of those who had known him, but in the hearts of every child who came to the garden to write, to plant, and to dream. As Isabella entered the later years of her life, she began to prepare for the time when she, too, would join Gabriel. Though her body grew frail, her spirit remained strong, sustained by the love that had carried her through the years. She continued to spend her days in the garden, her beloved sanctuary, and found comfort in knowing that it would outlast her. One autumn evening, as the leaves began to change color and the air grew crisp, Isabella sat in the garden for what she knew would be one of the last times. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden light over the trees and flowers that surrounded her. She smiled, feeling the presence of Gabriel beside her, as if he had been waiting for her all along. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small envelope, the final letter she had written to Gabriel. She had written many letters to him since his passing, but this one was different. It was her farewell, her way of telling him that she was ready to join him in the next chapter of their journey. Isabella placed the letter beneath the roots of the tree they had planted together on the day they moved into their home. She whispered a few words to the wind, knowing that wherever Gabriel was, he would hear her. "I'll see you soon, my love." With that, she sat back, closed her eyes, and let the warmth of the sunset wash over her. In the quiet of the garden, surrounded by the beauty they had created together, Isabella felt a deep sense of peace. That night, she passed away in her sleep, her heart full, her soul content. She had lived a life of love, a life of purpose, and she had left behind a legacy that would continue to bloom long after she was gone. Isabella was laid to rest beside Gabriel, in the heart of the garden they had built together. A simple stone marker was placed at her grave, inscribed with the words from Gabriel's final poem, "For love like ours, eternal will." The garden continued to flourish under the care of the Montgomery Grayson Foundation, and people from all over the world came to visit the place where Isabella and Gabriel had once walked hand in hand. It remained a place of beauty, reflection, and inspiration, a place where love was celebrated in all its forms. And though Isabella and Gabriel were no longer there in body, their spirits lived on in every tree, every flower, and every word written by the children who came to the garden to plant their own seeds of hope. In the end, their love had not just endured, it had grown, spreading across generations and touching countless lives. The garden, like their love, would continue to bloom forever. Their story, one of courage, creativity, and an unbreakable bond, would live on in the hearts of all who visited the garden. It was a love that had defied time, transcended loss, and left a legacy that would never fade. And as the seasons changed, the flowers bloomed, and the trees stretched toward the sky, the garden stood as a testament to the truth that Isabella and Gabriel had always known. Love, once planted, will live forever. Years after Isabella's passing, the garden had become even more renowned, with visitors from all over the world coming to experience its beauty and learn about the legacy of love that Isabella and Gabriel had left behind. The garden had expanded, with new sections dedicated to creativity, reflection, and love in all its forms. It became more than a memorial. It was a living, evolving space that continued to grow just as their love had grown. The new caretakers of the garden, including Clara and others from the Montgomery Grayson Foundation, ensured that the spirit of the garden remained intact. They encouraged young people to visit, learn, and contribute their own creativity, continuing the work Isabella and Gabriel had started. One of the newest initiatives was called the Garden of Stories, a project where visitors could leave their own poems, letters, or thoughts behind in special journals placed throughout the garden. These journals were collected annually, and some of the most touching or inspiring stories were published, ensuring that the garden's visitors would continue to inspire one another for generations to come. One such visitor was a young woman named Sophia, a poet struggling to find her voice. She had heard about the garden from a friend and decided to visit, hoping to find inspiration in the place that had once been the heart of Isabella and Gabriel's love. Sophia wandered through the garden, her heart full of questions. She had been writing poetry since she was a child, but she had never found the confidence to share her work. She often doubted herself, wondering if her words were enough, if they could truly touch someone the way Gabriel's poems had. She sat beneath the heartwood tree, feeling the weight of her insecurities. As she sat in the peaceful quiet of the garden, she noticed a journal resting on the nearby bench. Curiosity piqued. She opened it and found it filled with messages from visitors. Some were short notes of gratitude, others were poems or letters. One message, in particular, caught her eye. "I once thought my words didn't matter. But I found my voice here, in this garden." Love gives us the strength to share our hearts, no matter how fragile they may seem. Sophia smiled as she read the words, feeling as if they had been written just for her. She realized that she wasn't alone in her doubts and that the garden was a place where people came to find not just inspiration but courage, the courage to share their voices, to live authentically, and to love without fear. Sophia returned to the garden many times over the following months, using the peaceful environment to fuel her creativity. She wrote poems under the trees, scribbled thoughts in her journal while sitting by the rose bushes, and read the writings left by other visitors, finding comfort in the fact that so many others had struggled with the same insecurities she faced. One day, as she sat near the statue of Gabriel, she felt a shift within her, a quiet, but undeniable sense that she was ready. Ready to share her words with the world, to embrace the vulnerability that came with opening her heart. She had learned, from the garden and from Gabriel's legacy, that love and creativity were intertwined, that the act of writing itself was an act of love, a gift to the world, whether it was received by one person or 1,000. Inspired, Sophia approached Clara, who had become the director of the foundation. She asked if there was a way for her to contribute her poetry to the garden's growing collection. Clara, recognizing the passion in Sophia's eyes, invited her to read her work at the next Garden of Stories Festival, an event where writers, poets, and artists shared their creations in the very space that had inspired so many. The day of the festival arrived, and Sophia stood on the small stage that had been set up beneath the heartwood tree, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked out at the audience, some familiar faces, some strangers, and felt the weight of her words in her hands. For a brief moment, she doubted herself, but then she thought of Isabella, of Gabriel, and of the courage it must have taken for them to live the life they had chosen. With a deep breath, Sophia began to read her poem. Her voice was soft at first, but as she spoke, the words flowed more easily, each line a tribute to love, to resilience, and to the journey she had taken to find her voice. By the time she finished, the audience was silent, but in their silence, Sophia felt something profound, a connection, a shared understanding. When the applause came, it was not overwhelming or loud, but it was filled with warmth, with love. And in that moment, Sophia knew she had found her place, her voice, and the courage to continue sharing it with the world. As Sophia continued to write and grow as a poet, her connection to the garden deepened. She became one of the regular contributors to the Montgomery Grayson Foundation's creative programs, mentoring young writers who came to the garden looking for the same inspiration she had found. Sophia knew that her words, like Gabriel's, could plant seeds of hope and courage in others, and she was committed to nurturing those seeds. The garden itself flourished in ways Isabella and Gabriel could never have imagined. New sections were added over the years, each one dedicated to a different aspect of creativity or reflection. A labyrinth of reflection was built, where visitors could walk in silence, contemplating their journeys and the choices that had led them there. A pavilion of words was constructed, where poets, writers, and storytellers could gather to share their work in the open air, surrounded by the beauty of nature. One of the garden's most cherished new features was the memory tree, a tree where visitors could hang small scrolls of paper with personal stories, poems, or messages for loved ones. Each year, the tree became adorned with hundreds of these scrolls, and it had become a tradition to read them aloud during the annual Memory Night, an event where the community came together to celebrate both love and loss, and the ways they were intertwined. Through it all, the garden remained a place where love, creativity, and resilience were nurtured. It was a place where people came to heal, to grow, and to find their voices. And while Isabella and Gabriel were no longer physically present, their spirit infused every corner of the space they had created. Decades later, the garden still stood as a testament to the power of love, creativity, and the legacy of two people who had dared to build a life on their own terms. The Montgomery Grayson Foundation had expanded globally, supporting artists, writers, and dreamers all over the world, but the original garden remained its heart. Visitors continued to come from far and wide to walk its paths, to read the words of those who had come before them, and to leave their own stories behind. Each new generation brought fresh ideas, fresh perspectives, but they all shared one thing in common: the belief that love, whether romantic, platonic, or creative, was the most powerful force in the world. On the anniversary of Gabriel's passing each year, the garden hosted a special celebration in his honor, where people gathered to share poetry, music, and stories beneath the stars. As the night drew to a close, lanterns were released into the sky, carrying with them the hopes, dreams, and messages of love left by those who had been touched by the garden's magic. And as the lanterns drifted into the night, the garden, ever growing, ever blooming, stood as a reminder that love, once planted, can never die. It flourishes, it spreads, and it leaves a mark on the world that will last long after we are gone. In the end, the garden was not just a place of memory, it was a place of life, of growth, and of endless possibility. It was a place where love, in all its forms, bloomed eternally. And so, the story of Isabella and Gabriel, and the garden they had built together, lived on, an eternal testament to the power of love to transform the world. Many years had passed since Isabella and Gabriel's love had first bloomed in the garden they built together. The garden, now a global symbol of love and creativity, continued to thrive under the stewardship of the Montgomery Grayson Foundation. But as the garden grew, so did the need for a new kind of leadership, someone who could both preserve its legacy and introduce new ideas to carry it forward. Sophia, the young poet who had once found her voice in the garden, had become one of its most cherished caretakers. Her deep connection to the garden and her understanding of its significance had made her a natural successor to Clara as the garden's new keeper. Sophia had already spent years nurturing the creative programs, mentoring young writers, and expanding the reach of the foundation, but now she was tasked with an even greater responsibility, ensuring that the garden remained a place of love, healing, and inspiration for future generations. On her first official day as the new keeper of the garden, Sophia took a quiet moment to herself, walking the paths that had once guided her toward her own sense of purpose. The garden, in all its beauty, was a reflection of the love and creativity that had been poured into it for decades, but Sophia knew that it was more than that. It was a living entity, constantly evolving with each new person who visited, each new story that was written, each new seed that was planted. As she reached the heartwood tree, she found herself thinking of Isabella and Gabriel, their courage to live authentically, their dedication to each other, and the way they had turned their love into something that would outlast them. She placed her hand on the tree's bark, feeling the life within it, and whispered a quiet promise to them both. "I'll carry your legacy forward. I'll make sure this garden keeps blooming." As the new keeper, Sophia introduced new programs that continued to expand the garden's reach, making it accessible to an even wider audience. One of her most important initiatives was the Garden for All program, which sought to bring people from underserved communities into the garden to experience its healing power and creative inspiration. Sophia knew that art, poetry, and love should not be reserved for the privileged few, they were universal, and the garden had always been a place where everyone was welcome, regardless of their background. Through partnerships with schools, community organizations, and social programs, Sophia worked to ensure that anyone who sought the garden's peace could find it. One of the most impactful projects that came out of the Garden for All initiative was a collaboration with local hospitals, where patients, particularly those facing long-term illnesses, were invited to visit the garden to spend time in nature and participate in creative workshops. The patients, many of whom had limited mobility or had spent months in sterile hospital environments, found solace and renewal in the garden's natural beauty. During one of these visits, Sophia met an elderly man named Marcus, who had been undergoing cancer treatment. Marcus had once been a painter, but after his diagnosis, he had lost the motivation to continue his work. Sophia invited him to sit in the garden's pavilion of words, where a small easel had been set up, and gently encouraged him to pick up a paintbrush again. At first, Marcus was hesitant, but as he began to paint, something shifted within him. He could feel the energy of the garden around him, the life in the trees, the flowers, the air, and it reminded him of why he had started painting in the first place. "This place," he told Sophia quietly as he worked, "it makes you believe in life again." Through the Garden for All initiative, countless others like Marcus found hope and inspiration. The garden had always been a place of healing, but now, under Sophia's leadership, it became even more of a sanctuary for those in need of a second chance, a place where creativity and love could bring light to even the darkest moments. Sophia's vision for the garden wasn't just about honoring the past, it was about looking forward, ensuring that the garden continued to evolve with the world around it. One of her most ambitious projects was the Future in Bloom initiative, which invited young people from all over the world to participate in the creation of new garden spaces, each one reflecting the challenges, hopes, and dreams of their generation. The Future in Bloom project was about more than just planting trees and flowers, it was about using the garden as a platform for dialogue, creativity, and change. Young leaders from various fields, including environmental science, art, and social justice, came together to design spaces within the garden that addressed some of the most pressing issues of their time, such as climate change, mental health, and social inequality. One of the first new spaces created through this initiative was called the Circle of Resilience, a space designed by a group of young climate activists. It featured native plants that thrived in the changing environment, and its circular layout symbolized the interconnectedness of all living things. Visitors could sit in the circle, surrounded by the beauty of nature, and reflect on their own relationship with the planet. Another space, called the Path of Reflection, was created by a group of mental health advocates. It was designed as a quiet, meditative walk through a shaded part of the garden, with benches and small alcoves where visitors could pause to reflect, write, or simply sit in silence. At the end of the path stood a small fountain, symbolizing renewal and the healing power of time. Through these new spaces, the garden continued to grow, not just in size, but in purpose. It became a place where the younger generation could express their creativity, their concerns, and their vision for a better world, all while honoring the legacy of Isabella and Gabriel's love. As the years passed, the garden became more than just a place, it became a living, breathing symbol of everything Isabella and Gabriel had stood for: love, resilience, creativity, and the courage to live authentically. People from all walks of life continued to visit, leaving their own marks on the garden, contributing their stories, their art, and their love. Sophia, now an older woman herself, often sat by the heartwood tree, reflecting on the incredible journey the garden had taken her on. She had once been a young, unsure poet, seeking her voice in the quiet spaces of the garden, and now she was the keeper of its legacy, ensuring that it would continue to bloom long after she was gone. One day, as she sat beneath the tree, a young girl approached her, much like she had once approached Isabella all those years ago. The girl, shy and uncertain, asked if Sophia could read the poem she had written. Sophia smiled, feeling the familiar warmth in her heart. She took the notebook from the girl and read the words, simple yet filled with emotion, and knew that the garden's future was in good hands. This young girl, like so many others, had found her voice in the garden, just as she had. "You have a gift," Sophia said gently, handing the notebook back. "Never stop sharing it." The girl smiled, her confidence growing. "Thank you." As the girl ran off to join her friends, Sophia looked up at the heartwood tree, its branches stretching toward the sky. She felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that the garden, and the love that had created it, would continue to inspire, heal, and grow for generations to come. In the end, Isabella and Gabriel's legacy had become something much greater than a single love story. It had become a symbol of the power of love itself, a force that could transform lives, bring people together, and create beauty in even the most unexpected places. And as long as the garden stood, their love would live on, blooming eternally in the hearts of all who visited. As the years turned into decades, the garden that Isabella and Gabriel had nurtured continued to flourish, a living testament to the love they had shared and the lives they had touched. The garden had become more than a sanctuary, it was now a symbol of the enduring power of love, creativity, and human connection. Visitors from all over the world still came to walk its peaceful paths, to sit beneath the heartwood tree, and to leave their own stories, poems, and letters, each one contributing to the garden's ever-growing legacy. Under Sophia's gentle care, and later under the guidance of new generations of caretakers, the garden evolved with the times, but its heart remained the same. It was a place where love could be expressed in countless forms, through words, through art, through nature itself, and where every visitor found a piece of themselves reflected in its beauty. As time passed, Isabella and Gabriel's story became a legend, told to every new visitor who walked through the garden's gates. Their love, which had once defied society's expectations, had grown into something timeless, inspiring everyone who heard it to believe in the possibility of a love that could endure all trials, all obstacles, and even the passage of time. One evening, as the sun set over the garden, casting a golden glow over the trees and flowers, a young couple stood by the statue of Gabriel, holding hands. They had come to the garden to celebrate their own love, inspired by the story of Isabella and Gabriel. As they looked around at the beauty that surrounded them, they felt a deep sense of connection, not just to each other, but to the legacy of love that had been cultivated here for so many years. And so, the garden lived on, a place where love would always bloom. In the end, Isabella and Gabriel's greatest gift was not the garden itself, but the love that had made it possible, the love that had spread its roots deep into the hearts of everyone who visited, a love that would continue to grow, to flourish, and to inspire, long after they were gone. Their love, eternal and boundless, would forever bloom in the garden they had created together. And as long as love existed, the garden would stand, a living symbol of the truth that love, once planted, can never truly die. It lives on in the hearts it touches, and in the places it transforms. A love that blooms forever.